In this video, I'd like to explore crime statistics, different theories on why people commit crimes, and also the effectiveness of different solutions. First, let's take a look at crime statistics in the US. The primary source I'll be using is the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. It tracks crimes against the person, which includes murder, rape, and aggravated assault. There are also crimes against property, which includes arson, burglary, larceny, theft, and auto theft. There's also a third type of crime that's also not tracked very well. It's called victimless crimes. You can think of drugs, gambling, and prostitution. In 2017, there were 1.25 million violent crimes. The crime rate is actually a much better way of understanding trends since it takes into account the size of the population. In the same year, the violent crime rate was around 383 per 100,000 people. There were about 7.7 million property crimes, and the property crime rate was around 2,362 per 100,000 people. I should note that these numbers may not be a true representation of crime in the US. Sometimes crime can go unreported, maybe because the victim felt too embarrassed or hurt to report, or it could also be because the victim did not feel safe reporting the crime. That's why you may want to consider victimization surveys. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in 2017, the rate of violent victimization was around 20.6 per 1,000 people, aged 12 or older. In the same year, the rate of violent victimization reported was around 9.2 per 1,000 people, aged 12 or older. Now let's look at common trends among criminals. I should note here that once again, these statistics can be misleading since they only show the people that are caught and arrested for crime. First, let's look at age. Here's what the distribution looks like. As you can see, murderers are often between the ages of 20 and 24. If you look at gender, you will see that men commit murder far more often than women. Let's also look at economic status and its ties to victimization. One study conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that people below the federal poverty level had more than double the rate of violent victimization as persons in high-income households. In other words, poverty is correlated with higher rates of victimization. Now I'd like to discuss a few theories on the reasons and causes surrounding criminal activity. The first I'd like to discuss is poverty. This should be somewhat intuitive. One motive could be that one lacks essential goods such as food, water, clothing, etc., and this leads one to commit theft in order to attain these things. Additionally, selling contraband such as guns and drugs may be a way to get money and escape this current situation. Lack of education and unemployment are usually problems that plague those who are in poverty, so they don't have as many options as those with better resources. Another cause could be bad friends and family. Hanging around certain type of people will affect your behavior, the way you perceive things, and also your moral compass. Another cause could be mental illnesses. Some people may suffer from a severe chemical imbalance within the brain. Self-interest or greed could be another factor. Imagine you have the option to embezzle funds, engage in insider trading, or to sell drugs, and in doing so you became a millionaire. You may be tempted to continue your illegal actions even if you have a lot of money. The disintegration of the family unit is another interesting factor. When a child is raised in a broken home, they may turn to a gang, which may serve the same functions that a family would. Some believe that being exposed to violence may increase one's willingness to engage in violent activities. In 1982, the National Institute of Mental Health identified the following as major effects of children seeing violence on television. Children may become less sensitive to the pain and suffering of others. Children may become more fearful of the world around them. Children may be more likely to behave in aggressive or harmful ways towards others. On a related note, video game violence has been an area of debate recently. In 2010, psychologist Craig A. Anderson concluded that, quote, "The evidence strongly suggests exposure to violent video games is a causal risk factor." Conversely, psychologist Christopher J. Ferguson, in his own review, contested those results. He claimed that much of the research in this area has failed to control for other factors such as mental health and family life. On top of this, those who actually play video games are definitely aware of how graphics and audio has advanced over the past few decades. The technology in this area is constantly changing, and this can make it even more difficult to determine the actual effect of violent media on our behavior. With the advancements in VR technology, this area will only become more difficult to understand. Let's move on to the prison system in the US. There are two main types, public and private. They differ in many aspects: security, the source of their funding, the types of inmates they house, and more. Public prisons are prisons owned and operated by local, state, and federal governments. The inmates in these prisons are monitored and directed by state and federal guidelines. The funding for these prisons come from tax dollars. Private prisons are run by private third-party companies. They receive money from government contracts, and these amounts depend on the number of prisoners housed and the average length of time served. This often means the more prisoners and the longer the sentences, the more money is earned. For example, imagine you're running a prison and it costs $75 a day to house a prisoner, and your prison can house 500 prisoners. You can actually charge $125 per prisoner per day. Usually the government would award you with this contract so long as the price you offer is cheaper than the cost of a public prison. Theoretically, this may seem like a good way to bring down the cost of prison, but there are reasons to be concerned. First of all, the goal of a prison system should be to rehabilitate most of the prisoners. The goal of a private prison, however, is to make money. Let me give you a clear example. Imagine you're running a prison and it costs you around $75 a day per prisoner, and the government pays you $150 a day per prisoner housed. You find out that you can cut down costs from $75 to $60 by removing certain cleaning services. The problem here is that this can lead to dirty, inhumane living conditions. Additionally, if private prisons properly rehabilitated every prisoner that went behind bars, then that would be bad for business. Another problem arises from lobbying. The business model of private prisons is to obtain more prisoners, since more prisoners and longer sentences equates to more money. As a result, private prisons can influence politicians in different ways so that harsh and arguably unjust laws are in place and enforced. For example, according to a Washington Post article from 2015, the two largest for-profit prison companies in the US, GEO and the Corrections Corporation of America, had funneled more than $10 million to candidates since 1989 and spent around $25 million on lobbying efforts. To give you an example, Marco Rubio has been criticized for his connections to the nation's second largest for-profit prison company, GEO. Back when Marco Rubio was Speaker of Florida's House of Representatives, GEO was rewarded with a contract for a $110 million prison. Over his career, he has received over $40,000 in campaign donations from GEO. According to a report by the Justice Policy Institute, the private federal prison population nearly doubled between 2000 and 2010. In 2016, 8 to 10% of the total state and federal prison population were incarcerated in private prisons. I'd like to give you an idea of how the US compares to other countries in this area. Here is the incarceration rate per 100,000 people for OECD countries. And here's the incarceration rate per 100,000 people compared to all countries. In 2008, the incarceration rate peaked in the US, and about 1 in 100 adults was imprisoned. This incarceration rate exceeded the average levels of incarceration in the Gulag system under the Soviet Union. Not everyone in prison is also a rapist or murderer. Around 1 in 5 people, around 456,000, were locked up for a drug offense in 2018. I'd also like to discuss the 13th Amendment. This is often known as the constitutional amendment that ended slavery in 1856. This amendment made it so that slavery was deemed unconstitutional, with the exception of slavery as a punishment for crime. In other words, if you are convicted of a crime, it is possible that you will be legally enslaved. And by enslaved, I mean you will have to work and not get paid for it. Although usually the prisoners do get paid, but they get paid a very small wage. The work that the prisoners do is often referred to as penal labor. There have been strikes by prisoners in 2010, 2015, 2016, and even as recently as 2018. The prisoners often protested for better wages and living conditions. Mass incarceration is a problem that has negative economic and social effects. Here are just a few of them. It hurts the nation's overall productivity and employment. When people have a record, it becomes far more difficult for them to obtain a job. Inmates who may have been willing to become law-abiding, productive members of society instead may be tempted to return to a life of crime. Another problem is that it can lead to broken families. More specifically, children who have a parent in prison are likely to suffer socially and psychologically. Children from broken homes are more likely to commit crimes themselves. Another problem is that it costs money. Ironically, the private prison system, as I mentioned before, was expected to reduce the overall cost of incarceration, but lobbying efforts from the private sector has led to harsher laws and longer, stricter sentencing. You also have to take into consideration that your tax dollars could have gone to education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Instead, it's being used to lock people up. That's all for this video. If you liked it and can afford to do so, please consider donating to my Patreon or PayPal. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.